Welcome to Thrivecast, a community podcast series where we are meeting with growth leaders and monetization leaders around the world. With me, I have Achintya Gupta today, and our today's topic is modern GTM for developer-focused companies. Achintya, welcome to the podcast.
Hey Guru, thanks for having me here.
Happy to host you, Achintya. You have been a business manager. You have run GTMs for various companies. You also founded a previous company, which is a startup. It looks like you raised a lot of capital called Philo, and now you are on the journey to go build a completely new startup for developer-based GTM, called Reo.dev.
Yeah,
Tell us a little about yourself, and then you know uh, maybe segue into why did you start building Rio.dev, and what was the motivation behind it?
sure. So um, I have only worked in startups across my career, and and I started with the marketing side of things, but moved into the sales and the business side of things. So if I have to summarize my career in one line, I have mostly launched new products in the market and then seen them find a product
Hmm.
market and seen them scale. And then that I have done across fintech. And in that fintech, I started with insurance and then moved to the lending side of things. And then understood that, okay, lending is going to be all about data and all about data pipes. Was interested to start in building something on my own and worked in a developer tool company called Philo. That was essentially about building data pipes for creators and influencers data. And that is where looking at the developer motion, and I started realizing that, hey, developer SaaS is going to grow really big. They're going to be, I started understanding some of these challenges which I faced firsthand at Philo, where all my developer intent signals were really important for me for understanding, okay, what are the organizations that are interested in us, but it was all scattered, all anonymous. And that is where I thought that is this problem needs to be solved. And yeah, that's what we are doing at Reo.dev. Reo.dev is a growth stack for developer focused companies. Essentially, for these companies, the true intent signals lies in developer activities around their ecosystem. But the challenge is these activities are looking at the basic nature of how developers try out things are very hidden. Like, for example, who forked your GitHub repository, who executed your npm command, or who is deeply studying your technical documentation. So these are some very different intent signals that world has seen, earlier, like who read a topic or who visited your website. That's what used to be earlier. So looking at these, this is what we do. We look at de-anonymizing all these intent signals and then helping our customers understand is these are the companies and these are developers who are interested, and then give them a platform, give them patterns to actually take this intent to the last mile and convert them to customers.
A developer-focused GTM seems very complex. I mean, typically, maybe in 2016, 2017, probably the movement started with AWS selling to developers. And now there's a plethora of tools, all the way from databases to, code scanning and so many, many things. In fact, it's a very thriving business. So what led you to start thinking that this is a large market that you should solve? And, you know, and, and what's so different about selling to developers or GTMing to developers?
Yeah, great question, Guru. So there are a couple of trends which are fairly macroeconomic in nature, and that came from first-hand experience. The first one was that the problem is real and it is big. Like so if you look at um, 10 years back, there were not so many developer SaaS or developer infra companies. But if you look today, many of these organizations, or if you see some of the new startups, a lot of focus is on developer infra and developer SaaS side. In fact, what was like the SaaS of the last decade is what is like, the developer infra for this decade. So really, there are a lot of organizations, and why there are so many organizations, perhaps it is because the demand for software is much more than the supply of developers. or sort of how new technologies are coming up. Actually, the reasons are many, but yes, the problem is real that there are so many companies and hence so many marketers and business folks who are looking at solving this problem of getting revenue out of a developer motion. And when I realized this problem firsthand, I realized that, hey, it's a good problem to solve. And that's why, this is what we are doing at Reo.dev. And then one other macro trend that I wanted to discuss, since you asked that, what's so different about, is because, once you go deep, you realize that developer GTM is actually unique. And what is so unique about it is, like, if you look at 10 years back, even when the number of these companies was small, uh, the GTM still was top down. It was to a business buyer, and it was very marketing or sales led. What has changed the last 10 years is the developer has become really powerful in an organization. And suddenly, in the developer focused companies, there are two personas who are responsible for purchase decisioning. There is a user who is a developer, who is essentially looking at building things before they buy, and then there is a buyer, an economic buyer, and then this buyer is very, very influenced by the developers. So it's a very different kind of emotion which needs to be solved with data. And yeah, that is what excites us at Reo.dev.
Yeah, I can relate to that. We're also building a SaaS product which is targeted to developers, so I can understand. In fact, some of my previous experiences in the past companies where I was also the buyer, and I had a team of a large team of global developers, and I saw
Mhm.
this in action. There's a company called as JetBrains. My team actually came up to me and said, "Hey, they need a tool." To manage Go development, Go language development, to debug it, to code, to set breakpoints, to ship it, and integrate with AWS. And they looked at various tools. Unbeknownst to me, they did not talk to me about that. But one fine day, I got a notice that about 40 developers from my team are interested to acquire,
Wow.
licenses for JetBrains.
Right.
And so that led me to say, I had no idea about that. And they actually made a proposal to me that, hey, this is how you can go buy. And then I looked at, I became the buyer, and I was starting to look at, how do I go acquire it? Is there a procurement process around it? There was no sales team. I had to go online to them and then put the number of developer licenses that I acquire, and they gave me for one developer it was 5% discounted. For 40 it was about 8 or 10% discounted. So they
Yeah.
already had tiering within that, and my team was already using a free plan, right? So they already had a free plan, they had deployed it, and they were getting stuck at some premium plans where they were not able to go debug or deploy more to AWS. That's where the escalation came in. So I can totally relate to what you're saying about this. But maybe could you tell a little about the typical playbook that you'd advise some startups to think about GTM to developer? I know JetBrains is probably in the business for quite some time,
Right.
but what's a playbook that you could advise?
Right. So, um, perhaps, so the first thing that we advise to developer focused companies is they really need to understand the developer GTM motion, because it is fundamentally very different, and they are working with a different persona, like a developer whom they probably might not have interacted for long. Like, most of the marketers are coming from the other side,
Hmm.
like marketed SaaS, but they might not have marketed developers. So uh, the first thing is understanding the whole developer GTM. And once you look at it, as you were saying, actually, it was a great example, Guru, because you clearly demonstrate that there are two personas who have very different motivations. One is like the developer, right? And their motivation is actually not to purchase. Their motivation at that point of time, even in your case, was to solve their challenge. Like, they were building an engine, and they were searching for the right nuts and bolts or the fuel for that engine, right? And and for them, the motivation is, can their problem be solved by this tool? And they are looking at it essentially like building things before they buy, right? And that's the other case where you as a buyer, right, which is the next persona, are looking at sort of economic scalability, business case, right? How will this technology partner scale with our organization, and so many other things, right? So one is that that understanding that it's a very different motion with very different motivations of the two personas. The other is that the the GTM motion essentially has to be hybrid. That means you have a strong bottoms up motion to activate the developers, which is a lot about education, because in most of the cases, as we discussed, these are guys are not looking at the purchase, but sort of finding a solution to their problem. And at the other end, the GTM for a business buyer has to be, or ideally should be, top down. So once you understand, and that's one thing, right? Once you understand the developer GTM motion, a lot of things actually become easier to understand. A lot of playbooks, if look or become easy to understand. And essentially, if you look at some of the popular playbooks, they revolve around two or three things, right? The first is, you of course create a very strong developer experience ecosystem around your product. That means you measure things like how easy it is for a developer to reach like a hello world, or the time to first wow, or how easy it is for them to engage some other person on their team, right? So the that becomes a very important thing. The second is, once you have that corrected, the next set of playbooks are around how do you activate more developers into this experience. And that comes around creating great content, great documentation, great guide, community support ecosystem around it. That okay, if somebody is active, interested, then how do you take them to a win in their build before you buy. And the third playbook, and which is actually the missing link, but the most important, and one you will see most of the successful developer tool companies following, is once you have this great bottoms up motion of developers, how do you mine this data of developer activities and interest to understand that, okay, these are the organizations who are interested. And most importantly, this is the right time to get in. And many organizations, if you look at Confluent, you look at HashiCorp, it's like, I mean, they have cracked this really really well. And once you do that, this essentially start providing you the entire pipeline to close your GTM motion. So yeah, that's how we are seeing the space evolving, and feel it is really really interesting.
So what you're saying is, I'm just going into my head. I'm trying to kind of break down what you just said. What changed is that marketing has changed. Right? Instead of they selling it to the top-down, buyer, they are selling it to the users. They are selling use cases to the end user. Right? In this case, who is a developer, which is a very different, change altogether. You're also saying in that the product needs to become extremely easy for the developers to go experience the first wow effect or the first aha moment,
Yeah.
right? So the product engineering has changed quite a bit. You also mentioned about logging of usage data, could be telemetry data. I mean, are you talking about the anonymous user data collection that Microsoft and other tools would, like, even if you download Terraform template now, you ask you for do you want to send your usage data anonymously? Is that what you're talking about, the telemetry data, or is that something else?
So it can be across, right? So when we work with some of these organizations, we see that they are interested in understanding developer activity across channels. We have seen
Mm-hmm.
that few, in fact, 3 out of 4 might not be so open today to exposing telemetry data,
Mm-hmm.
but they are still open or interested in knowing who are the developers who are doing activities on their GitHub repositories, who are the ones who are studying their documentation. So it's like there is a journey in their head that somebody comes on their GitHub repo,
Mm-hmm.
so the community moves on to doc, moves on to the cloud product, and can they build a journey around it? Yes, many of them, as you correctly mentioned, look at telemetry data also. And so the idea is that wherever there's a developer intent signal, the organizations, under the constraints of the privacy guideline, of course, should be able to understand the developers and the organizations behind it. Look at patterns from there. For example, in this organization, 10 developers are trying me out. So there is an internal virality. Probably it's the right time to get in. And probably
Mm-hmm.
one more thing which probably you missed, Guru, but wanted to add here is understanding the motivations behind these two personas, which most of the marketers miss. Uh, so the most common word around developer marketing is, hey, developers don't want to buy, or they don't want to take my sales calls, or they have ad blockers. Of course, because if you understand their motivation, they are not looking at buying, or majority of them, they might be wearing a buyer's hat at certain point of time, but in majority of the cases they are looking at solving their problem. So hence, the playbooks have gone around solving their problem, which is more educational and activation related rather than
Ah, okay.
related.
Yeah. So the marketing essentially changes quite a bit. Meaning, instead of the having just a page about talking about features, they're talking more about use cases, how they can use it, how they can solve the problem. That's very interesting.
Right.
But I think you also mentioned a lot about the data telemetry. That's still ringing in my head. I mean, that's very
Mhm.
interesting. That today in today's world, if you are a SaaS builder and you have an open source tool that is on GitHub, you could actually measure the GitHub users and the collaborators and all of them. That's a signal by itself,
Yes.
right? Which I'm kind of going bonkers in my head. So that's an
Right.
intent signal by itself.
Yep.
You also mentioned, if they hang out in, let's say, support channels, or if they hang out in, let's say, Stack Overflow, and ask various questions, is that a signal like Reddit and you know Stack Overflow? Those also become intent signals for your product, or would
Yeah.
that be right to say?
So you will see developer interest signals across multiple channels. Like, for example, for a lot of our customers, we see developer intent signals across 4 or 5 different channels. It can be their own community, their open communities like a Stack
Hmm.
Overflow, can be their documentation. We see very, very strong intent signals of documentation. We see almost a journey across, in July, 2 developers looking at their docs. In August, 7 are doing it, and then these are the pages they are seeing, this is the amount of time they're spending, these are the interactions they're doing on a code level. A lot of it, and since you spoke about open source product, is about package manager installations, right? So developers will, if they're
Hmm.
building, so if they're serious about a product, they will interact with you on a code level, right? That's a very strong intent signal in itself, right? And yes, they will be trying out your cloud product. So what we realize is that you can't just look at one channel, because if you look at how developers evaluate product, it depends a lot about their persona and how they like to look at it. But you are creating an org picture, that how is this organization interested in you, and hence you will have to look at a lot more channels altogether.
Yeah, to maybe wrap this whole concept in your head, could you maybe share some successful companies who have done, something like this, in a very good way for a very long time? I know you
Right.
talked about HashiCorp. Could you maybe tell a story about how did they start? What was the success scenarios? Did they hire differently? Did they build differently? Did they market differently? Maybe if you could share some stories around it, that would be great.
Sure. So the most successful developer focused GTM motions we have seen actually have worked across the gambit of the playbooks. For example, they have cracked
Mm-hmm.
the product correctly and given the right kind of a tooling and an ecosystem to the developers to actually try it out. Like, for example, if you see HashiCorp's open source motion, right? I mean, it's massive, right? And when we talk to a lot of open source organizations, we learn that today 90 to 95% of their customers are the ones who were the users of their open source product, and from there they matured. Some of these matured organizations like Elastic invest a lot in mining the open source data. So they have teams, they have people, and they spend resources into actually looking at this and telling their teams that, okay, this is where an opportunity lies. So their GTM motions are acting like um, mini data mining and analysis teams. to actually look at this motion. And then yes, there's a very, very strong developer activation around it, both organic and then pushed by the organization. So they focus a lot on communities, right? So they are actually, it's a very balanced approach that we have seen, right? But it's focused towards understanding this persona, finding their motivations, and then really sort of taking and empowering the developers, looking at the
Hmm.
data, understanding which are the organizations interested in them, and then going to the buyers.
That's very interesting. I think you mentioned maybe a few times now about the differences between buyers versus users.
Mhm.
How does a startup who's building a developer-focused product, how do they differentiate this? Are there any tools out there in the market which can help you differentiate between, hey, these are the users of your product and these are the potential buyers? I'm guessing the buyers are essentially at the account level, maybe the VP of VP of engineering or CTOs. Could
Right.
you maybe share some examples of identifying users very differently than buyers and the tools and technologies around it? And then how do you go do this account based marketing at a later point in time?
Sure. So actually, that's a $1 million question. And yes, once you understand that there are two personas, that's the next thing you want to do, right? You want to understand, and because one of the
Mhm.
biggest mistakes developer focused organizations make, because they are not able to differentiate between these two personas, is sending the wrong messaging to the wrong persona, right? So you are sending a sales message to a user or a developer, and then you're sending an educational message to a buyer, right? Because you're not able to differentiate. So it's a $1 million question. A couple of ways how it is solved, right? And of course, that is where organized tools like us come into play. But what you see is the first way is, of course, to understand it on a channel level. If you understand the activities, you can understand, okay, this is a developer activity versus this is a buyer activity on the channel. So, like for example, um, so when we study the developer motion on our customers' product usage data, we can clearly understand that, okay, looking at the depth in which somebody is going, this is a developer or this is a user versus this is a buyer. Or if we look at sort of the pages or how deep they are studying docs. So one thing is that you can understand it from the activities and the patterns of activities. Second, of course, you can understand from a profile level if you can get it. If you can reach, understand, say from a
Mhm.
GitHub ID, that okay, this is this person in this organization, then from an or who has signed up on your cloud or form, etc. That's the second way you understand it. Some of the tools around there, of course, is like we have seen many organizations using reverse IP tooling on their docs, on their cloud product to understand, okay, these are the organizations who are active in the ecosystem. The third actually is cross pollination, and which we have seen is a great way of understanding intent, which is when you start seeing activities from various channel but sort of merging towards each other. So you will see that, okay, so like it's typically said, right? Organizations who are open source measure their GitHub stars, but now in the last 1 years, it is being often criticized, right? Have what does having 20K GitHub stars mean, right? And there are a lot of things flying around that how GitHub stars can be purchased. One very interesting intent signal we have started seeing is that developers who are really interested in a project, not just GitHub star one, but at the same period of time are
Mhm.
starring or looking and watching competitive or complementary repositories, right? So they're active not just on a repo, but they're
Mhm.
active on the ecosystem, right? And then we start seeing cross pollination that, okay, somebody's doing that, and then somebody is now over a period of time started looking into docs and then starting studying cloud products. So when you start doing that, you understand, okay, this is an organization where the users are ready, building something interesting, and now is a great time to reach out to the buyers, which you do by designation or authority in the organization.
I'm guessing maybe that's what your product is, right? It takes individual signals from GitHub, from documentation, from various places, combines them into a score, and maybe allows the SaaS builder who's building the developer focused GTM to be able to go score the potentiality of who can probably buy my product, and then reach out to them. Would that be right to assume that's what your product does? Maybe if you can give a quick spiel about your product.
Sure, Guru. So, yes, you are absolutely right. What we do is we use AI to very intelligently de-anonymize these intent signals under an account and tell you that, okay, these are the orgs who are really interested in you. These are the developers who are really interested. And then looking at the pattern, we tell you that these are the opportunities. These are the ones who are really hot, and then give you a platform to take to the last mile.
Got it. Super. I know we are out of time, but maybe a quick closing note. Have you seen any big fails in this particular space? Meaning somebody has tried something and they've either not achieved the primary goal or they have completely fallen flat, even publicly, about doing something wrong. Do you know of anyone who's done a bad job, at a developer focused GTM?
I think I think most of the good projects, if you get the product right, somehow the community handles you right. It's a startup, right? Blunders often happen. But probably the two most common mistakes that we see today is a treating developer are not taking into consideration the end buyer, right? Or these massive mistakes. These are two silos. There is a DevRel team thinking that, okay, we'll target developers, and there is a marketing and sales team that's looking at sort of something else, and they're not talking to each other, right? I think that is one of the biggest mistakes you can see, where you're not using an existing GTM motion to now use it for sales and marketing.
That's super. Again, thank you, Achintya, for your time. Really a pleasure to host you here. I especially learned quite a bit of things around the developer focused GTM. And to all our listeners, if you've enjoyed our today's discussion, please do leave a comment on your podcast platform. We will have it on various aggregators. Your feedback makes a big difference. And stay tuned for more insights. And if you have any guests that we should be talking to, always refer it back to us. Until next time, keep thriving.
Awesome. Thank you.